Hi, I'm Mike Harland from LifeWay Worship, and I'm excited to bring you into a town hall discussion about the state of church music in the worship era. And we have a wonderful group of friends that are here today to help us with this discussion. Men that lead ministries across state conventions in the Southern Baptist world, and great friends, people that have been on the front lines of church music ministry and worship ministry for years as leaders of churches and now as leaders in state convention work. 8 great friends of LifeWay Worship. We're thrilled to have them here, and we're going to together talk about church music in an era where worship becomes more and more focused and much more the emphasis than perhaps what used to be years ago in church music. Not that there's a difference between the two, but trying to understand what that looks like with a great group of leaders. And I want to welcome you guys here. So guys, and we'll let the screen tell them who you are. First of all, smile. Y'all look like a lineup in a police station, but all of you are great friends of ours that we've worked with and worked alongside of. It's a thrill to partner with you guys. And you lead work for state conventions in the area of music and worship resources. Some of you have roles that go a little bit outside that scope, but basically you focus in helping churches in the states where you live with church music ministry. So I'm going to throw out the big question that we're talking about. What is the state of church music in an era that is called the worship era? Anybody can join in and give us kind of an answer, a short answer to that question. Bubba, why don't you go first? You're from Kentucky.
I am from Kentucky, and it is a joy to get to do what I get to do on a daily basis. And I have highs and I have lows every day. And one of the choices or calls that I get on a daily basis are from pastors looking for resources for where they are in their music field. And someone said earlier that we are all over the map when it comes to church music today in our churches. We run the gamut on everything.
Paul, you're here in Tennessee. I think you were the one that made that statement we were talking about earlier. If you were to describe church music, you had a word. What, you remember the word you used?
I've said all over the map. Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? It's all over the map.
The best of the times, worst of times, perhaps. But I mean all over the map stylistically, even in terms of the whole worship environment, whether it be a high liturgy. We actually have some of those churches that are involved in that now, or whether it be storefront kind of band-driven, and everything in between.
Yeah. So let's say that we've got some pastors that are watching this, senior pastors, that may or may not be familiar with the terms of what we mean when we say something is contemporary or something is traditional. How would you describe to a pastor? John, I'll ask you this question. John Duncan from Georgia, how would you describe for a pastor different worship styles that are present in churches today?
Well, I think the styles in worship have kind of become somewhat of a difficult thing to nail down. It used to be, either you're traditional or you're non-traditional or more contemporary or blended. But now, like I said, when it's all over the map, it's multicultural, it's multi-generational, and so it has to have, I think the key thing for pastors to remember is that evaluate the church on the basis of its engagement in worship and what style best affects engagement in a meaningful way and in a theologically sound way. And pastors are the gatekeeper of that, and it's important to hold ministers of music accountable at that point, but not so much to be able to provide the coolest or the most traditional service in town in order to attract a particular type of crowd, but to simply engage people in biblical worship that honors the Lord.
Yeah. Now, David Manor, you've been leading in the Kansas-Nebraska convention, and what are you seeing in the churches in that part of the country related to multi-style approaches to ministry, or maybe even how small churches are approaching this? I mean, what do you see happening where you are?
Sure. We have multicultural congregations. We have a large Hispanic contingency out in western Kansas and Nebraska, so that's a completely different, unique style.
Wow.
Where some of those communities are more than 50% Hispanic. And so for us to work with those congregations, we have to have a different understanding and have people that help us through that understanding too, some catalysts that help us with that. So what John said is key. I think the reality is that worship leaders and pastors have to exegete their congregation and their community to determine what stylistically will best meet the needs of their congregation. So they've got to consider the culture they have and those that aren't there yet, but that are a part of that community as they plan to prepare for worship.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask Larry this question. Larry, what would you say to the pastor who makes the phone call and says, you know what, our church is really not growing, and we're thinking about going to this style of music to try to grow our church? What would be your response to that kind of a question?
And I've gotten that call several times. I think the statement would just be very simply that changing the style of worship will not net any sustainable growth in your church. It may pique curiosity for a short time, and you may have some onlookers to come in and check it out, but the sustainable growth will not come from changing worship style alone. It has to be in the overall approach of your whole church.
Yeah, well said. And guys, I want you all to feel like you can join in. Don't wait on me. David,
just one follow-up. It
Yeah.
won't grow up, but I don't think it'll kill it either. I think it can go both ways. And I think some believe if they go one direction, that's going to kill our worship. But I think it goes both ways. It's the underlying foundation is the issue that's going to determine whether it goes or.
It's really a spiritual process, isn't it? Yeah, Larry.
Well, and the heart of why you're looking at changing, is it to please people and to make a group of people happy, or is it to accomplish the Great Commission and to reach folks in what you're doing? I think the purpose of your change has got to be known.
Yeah, John.
I'd like to follow up just a little bit on that, because I think one of the roles that I think most of us participate in is trying to help educate ministers of music and pastors that style changes just for the sake of change is not a solid foundation on which to build upon. But if you're changing in order to become more biblical in your worship, that's a change worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, Steve, we haven't heard from you and Kenny yet, and I want to get you guys in here because Illinois and North Carolina are important states to us. So you two guys, I'll put it to both of you. So what would you say to that church that is thinking, okay, what we'll do, we've got a diverse congregation, we're in a diverse community, we're going to do a contemporary service at 8:30 and a traditional service at 9:30 and a bluegrass service at 2 o'clock. I mean, what would be your
I would
take
never
on that?
tell a pastor what they should do or shouldn't do, but let the Holy Spirit guide them.
Amen.
But I would share with them that you'll grow two different churches in your same building if you have different styles of worship. And you might find that you have competition among people in your church. I served a church many years ago that had a contemporary and a traditional worship. And the people in the church didn't like the other service. One said, you better take the drums off the stage when it comes time for our worship. And it wasn't harmonious. I think a better approach, if we're using terms, is multi-generational. And I know a lot of us talk about that a lot, but the difference between multi-generational and blended is I'm picking songs to make you happy, to help connect the old people and the young people in this culture or that culture. But multi-generational says not every element of worship is about you as an individual in the congregation. We'll try to find something to connect you to God, because that's what worship is connecting people to God. So we want you to be connected, but we also want you to, I want you to have the freedom to know when we sing a song you don't like, it's because we're blessing somebody else. We're trying to connect with them. And if the church gets the purpose in their mind that not every element of a worship service is for me, it quits becoming consumerism and it becomes connection to God. And your sacrifice of praise then is a song that you don't connect with. You look across the room and you see a young brother or sister raising their hand and blessing God. And all of a sudden you get great freedom, and as a worship leader, you get great freedom in how you pick your music. You can pick intentionally evangelistic music to help reach the lost. You can go and sing a hymn even if you're in a contemporary setting, and people have the commonality in their mind that whatever's not for them is for somebody else.
That's well said. Now, Kenny, before I let you jump in on that same question, I wanted John, we were talking about this subject a little bit before we started, and John, you made a statement about an inherent conflict between the disciple-making process and a consumer mentality. I don't know if you remember what you said, but I'd sure like for you to try to remember what you said as you were discussing that a minute ago.
Well, I think one of the big issues that we face when we come to church is that 24/7 we're invaded with the Burger King theology of have it your way.
Yeah.
And then when you come to church, when we're trying to make disciples, we're asked to prefer one another over that which we want. And moving from a consumer model to a discipleship making model sometimes have a hard time coexisting. And worship that is multi-generational is helping to teach people that we prefer one another. And by doing so, I think we're modeling disciple making over consumerism. And that's one of the big issues that we face with today in our worship.
Yeah, well said. Now, Kenny, in North Carolina, churches how are they approaching a multi-style? Do you see that happening more and more, less and less? What's your perspective?
We certainly do have a lot of churches with a multiple style of worship, but what I see more now are churches that are coming to me and saying, we have these multiple styles and we see 2 or 3 congregations in our church. We don't have unity there anymore. And so many of them are wanting to come back together in some kind of unified approach. I refer to it as unified or multi-generational, multi-ethnic. But it really seems to be a spiritual matter. If churches are too inward focused, it's all about me, as my brothers have just said. We don't seem to be able to achieve that unity that we so desperately want. I was working with a church not long ago that one of their high priorities was to bring their 2 services together. I had a contemporary and traditional, and they were saying, we want unity, but in their mind they said, we want unity as long as it looks like what I want it to look like. And until people can get that spiritual level of maturity and put that deference rather than preference in place, I don't think we're going to be able to achieve what God would desire to see, that unity in the body.
Wow. Yeah, that's some great thoughts. Slater, you look like you've...
Mike, we're seeing the same thing in Mississippi, same thing Kenny talked about. We're seeing churches that are wanting to come together because of the fellowship, because it's biblical. The Bible does not prefer one style over the other. In fact, the church worship together. And so we're influenced by that, and our pastors are wanting their churches to be unified in fellowship, unified in purpose, and strengthened for discipleship. And we're launching a discipleship effort this coming year, and what that means and how difficult it is to follow the process of a person growing in Christ. It's not a sudden thing. It takes a long time, and there's a lot we can do in worship to accomplish that. But secondly, I'm really influenced by my little mission church in New Orleans. Growing up, we had limited leadership, but we had great lay leadership. And through that experience, I mean, we were on the Broadman hymnal, then we went to the 56 Baptist hymnal, and then we had the Jesus movement that kicked in. And our church just embraced the new songs as they were birthed. We added those to our worship service. We sang out of the hymnal. We didn't have screens yet or any of that. But we just added the new songs, and everybody got along fine. There were no issues. The old folks loved the new songs because the kids were leading them and they were actually doing worship leadership.
Yeah.
And I think there's some strengthening in that today in Mississippi. We're seeing that we really need the older folks with the younger folks for the purpose of mentoring and discipleship. Yeah. This is very important to the life of a church. And so it has some carryover influence into what we select for worship and how we do this.
Paul, I want to come to you, but Slater, you've got me going here with a thought, and that is worship is, our young people, particularly children, any educator will tell us that children learn by imitation. What they see and they experience and they learn by seeing what others are doing. That's how we all learn. And think about the damage we could do if we take our children out of the worship experience. Now, I'm getting on a soapbox here a little bit, but if we remove our children where they never are around anyone else in any other generation, or even taking our young adults out and isolating them away from the generations of the church, I think there are places for that to happen that are appropriate, but the church needs to find ways for the generations to coexist because we learn from each other. The senior adults need the passion of the youth need the maturity of the senior adults, and if we keep them separated in the worship experience, how will they ever affect each other? And I'm through preaching. But now, was it Paul? Paul had a comment. So Paul,
you actually went I don't know whether it's sick minds or great minds or what, but that's exactly where I was going, because the question is, to me, as I see our churches pulling kids off, what are we training them up to do? You know, we're teaching them to sing their own group, their own set of songs, or to teach them to sing the songs of the teenagers or whatever. What are we teaching them to do? Are we teaching them to prefer one another?
That's cool. David?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that too, Mike. I think part of the problem is we're trying to cause that to occur just in the 1 hour on Sunday too.
Yeah.
So we bring them together and think, okay, if we get them together and we sing songs together, they're going to have unity as multi-generations. I think as worship leaders, we have a responsibility to lead them to worship not only when they gather, but when they disperse. And so how can we get those generations together to do other things, to serve, to pray together, to read Scripture together, to play together outside of the Sunday gathering. So when they gather on Sunday, it's an overflow of that relationship that happened during the week.